The cold sting of metal restraints bit into Darren's wrists as he was dragged across the polished stone floor of the alien temple. The grand hall, dimly illuminated by bioluminescent patterns pulsing across the walls, reeked of incense and blood. He struggled against the guards, towering figures wrapped in ceremonial armor, their reptilian eyes glowing with an eerie intensity, but they held firm. He was going to die. The realization settled like a weight in his gut. His ship had gone down in this sector, crash-landing on an uncharted world. What little he knew about the planet's inhabitants had come from panicked distress calls from his missing crewmates. The Zalari were not known for mercy. And yet, here he was, still breathing. His captors had spoken of a ritual, a rite of passage intertwined with judgment. The details were lost in their guttural dialect, but one thing was clear: he had been claimed. At the center of the hall stood a figure cloaked in deep crimson robes. She was unlike the other Zalari. Her features were sharper, her skin a striking shade of obsidian blue marked by swirling silver patterns. Her golden eyes locked onto him, unreadable, unyielding. A hush fell over the chamber as she approached. The guards forced him to his knees. "You stand before the House of Valfares, outsider," she spoke, her voice layered with an unearthly resonance. "You are here by my claim." Darren clenched his jaw. "I didn't exactly volunteer for this." A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors. The alien woman tilted her head, as if considering his defiance. Then, without another word, she raised a clawed hand. A ceremonial blade was placed in her palm, its surface gleaming with a liquid sheen, poison, perhaps. Darren's pulse quickened. She stepped closer, eyes locked onto his, and then, in a move that defied all logic, she slashed the blade across her own palm. The chamber gasped. The silver blood that dripped from her wound shimmered unnaturally. Darren had no time to react before she reached forward and pressed her bleeding palm to his chest. A searing heat spread through his body, as though fire had taken root beneath his skin. His vision swam. He gritted his teeth against the sensation, something ancient, something binding. Then, suddenly, it was over. She withdrew her hand, and Darren collapsed forward, panting. The guards loosened their grip on him. "It is done," the alien woman said. Her voice was softer now, laced with something he couldn't place. Darren's mind reeled. Whatever had just happened, he knew one thing: he had been changed. The gathered Zalari began to chant, their voices melding into a deep, guttural hum. The alien woman turned away from him, lifting the ceremonial blade once more. And that was when he realized what came next. The ritual wasn't just about binding. It was about sacrifice. His life was now forfeit. The alien woman hesitated, her grip tightening around the blade. Darren's breath came in short bursts. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment. A heartbeat passed. Then another. And then, against all expectation, she lowered the blade. Gasps of outrage echoed through the chamber. The high priest snarled something in their native tongue, stepping forward. She whirled to face them, standing between Darren and the gathered Zalari. For the first time since his capture, Darren saw something in her posture. Not dominance. Not cold ritual. But defiance. And in that moment, he understood, she couldn't do it. She was supposed to end him. But she couldn't walk away. And now, they would both pay the price. The chamber was deathly silent, save for the hiss of sharpened weapons being drawn. Darren remained on his knees, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts as the weight of the moment sank in. She hadn't killed him. Whatever strange ritual had just bound them together, whatever cosmic decree had demanded his death, she had defied it. And now, the fury of her people swelled in the air like an oncoming storm. The alien woman stood firm, her golden eyes locked onto the approaching elders. Their armored figures, adorned with jagged crests of bone and metal, radiated fury. The high priest, draped in flowing crimson, raised a clawed hand toward her. "You dishonor the blood pact, Vieiris," he spat in their native tongue, his voice dripping with venom. "You have allowed an outsider to share our sacred bond, yet you refuse to cleanse it." Vieiris. So that was her name. She lifted her chin, shoulders squared. "He is mine to judge." The priest snarled. "Then judge him. Strike now, and perhaps your disgrace will be forgiven." Darren barely had time to react before she turned, blade flashing. His stomach twisted. He had seen enough warriors hesitate only to fold under pressure. Was she really about to go through with it? But instead of plunging the blade into his throat, Vieiris lifted it high. With a sharp, decisive motion, she buried the weapon into the stone floor beside him. The force of the strike sent a crack splitting across the chamber, and the gathered warriors recoiled. "I have chosen," she declared. "The rite is complete." Murmurs erupted through the chamber. The priest's nostrils flared. "You cannot change the law." She tilted her head, voice like steel. "Then exile me." The murmurs became shouts of disbelief. Darren's breath caught in his throat. What the hell was she doing? Exile. From what little he understood of the Zalari, it was a fate worse than death. Stripped of her honor, cast from her people, she would be hunted like prey. And yet, she stood unflinching beneath the weight of their judgment. The priest's claws twitched. "Exile is not so merciful, Vieiris. You would be hunted. He will perish, and so will you." A pause. Then she did something that made Darren's stomach drop. She turned to him and spoke in his language. "Run." His mind barely had time to process it before she moved. With a speed that defied logic, Vieiris whirled, catching one of the guards off guard. Her fist slammed into his armored chest, sending him staggering back. The chamber erupted into chaos. Darren barely had time to move before she grabbed him by the arm and yanked him to his feet. Now. Adrenaline roared through his veins. He ran. The temple doors loomed ahead, massive and sealed. Before he could even think of a way through, Vieiris let out a guttural command. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for her to launch herself forward and strike the locking mechanism. The doors groaned open, and frigid night air poured in. Beyond the temple lay an expanse of darkened jungle, its alien flora glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was a death trap, filled with predators that hunted in the dark, but staying meant certain death. Darren didn't need to be told twice. He bolted. Vieiris was right beside him, her movements fluid despite the heavy armor she wore. Behind them, shouts erupted. The guards were in pursuit. They plunged into the jungle. The moment they crossed into the tree line, Vieiris grabbed him again, pulling him down into the undergrowth. "Stay low." Darren didn't argue. His heart hammered in his chest as he crouched beside her. Through the dense foliage, he could see the temple warriors pouring out of the temple, their glowing eyes scanning the darkness. "We won't outrun them," he hissed. She exhaled sharply. "We don't need to. We just need to vanish." Darren frowned. "You have a plan?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she removed the ceremonial sash from her armor, tearing the fabric into strips. "They track through scent. We need to mislead them." Darren raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" Vieiris gave him a sharp look before smearing the silver blood still dripping from her wounded palm across his cheek. He recoiled. "Are you serious? The scent will mask yours." Before he could protest, she smeared more of it along his collar, her expression unreadable. Her movements were swift, practiced, this was survival. "Move," she commanded. They crept through the thick underbrush, navigating the alien terrain with careful precision. Darren's boots sank into the soft earth, the humid air thick with the scent of strange flowers and something more metallic, blood, fresh and pungent. Every snap of a branch sent his nerves into overdrive. "They'll figure out we're not at the temple soon," he murmured. Vierisa's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "Then we move faster." They pressed on, deeper into the wilderness, until the temple lights were nothing but a distant glow behind them. Only then did Darren dare to whisper, "Why?" She didn't look at him. "Why what? Why save me? You could have killed me." That was the law, wasn't it? For the first time since they had fled, she hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Because I do not believe in a law that would force me to kill something that is mine." Her words sent a strange chill down his spine. He wasn't sure what unnerved him more, the fact that she had just claimed him as hers, or the fact that he didn't entirely hate it. The distant echoes of the hunting party's howls reminded them that the night was far from over. And their battle for survival had only just begun. The jungle breathed around them, alive with the hum of unseen creatures and the distant howls of the hunting party. Darren moved carefully, stepping where Vieira stepped, ducking when she ducked. His muscles ached from the constant tension, but he didn't dare stop. They were being pursued. Somewhere behind them, the Zalari warriors were tracking their scent, relentless and unforgiving. Darren had been hunted before, by mercenaries, by pirates, but never like this. This wasn't just about capture. This was about cleansing a mistake. A mistake named Darren. Vieira suddenly halted, raising a clawed hand in warning. Darren froze, heart hammering against his ribs. She tilted her head, listening, then whispered, "They're fanning out. We have little time." Darren swallowed hard. "Any bright ideas?" Her golden eyes flicked toward him, then toward the uneven terrain ahead. "We reached the river." Darren frowned. "Why?" "They track by scent. The water will break the trail." It was as good a plan as any. He nodded, and they pressed forward, keeping low as they weaved through the alien foliage. The deeper they went, the denser the jungle became, bioluminescent vines curling around towering trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, something like ozone. Then, Vieira stopped again. This time, her entire posture tensed. Darren didn't need to ask why. He heard it too. A rustle in the leaves. A faint, inhuman growl. They weren't alone. Vieira moved faster now, her steps precise, calculated. Darren followed as best as he could, but the underbrush snagged at his clothes, the uneven ground threatening to trip him with every step. The sound of pursuit grew closer. Then, a flash of movement. Vieira reacted instantly, shoving Darren aside as something lunged from the trees. A Zalari warrior, clad in blackened armor, crashed into the spot where Darren had just been, his blade carving through the air with deadly precision. Darren barely had time to react before Vieira engaged. Her movements were a blur, fluid, merciless. She deflected the warrior's strike with a flick of her wrist, her own blade dancing through the air. The clash of steel on steel sent sparks flying in the darkness. Darren scrambled back, reaching for the only weapon he had, a jagged piece of metal he'd salvaged from the wreckage days before. It wasn't much, but it was sharp. The Zalari warrior snarled something in their language, his voice dripping with fury. Vieira responded in kind, her tone cold. Then the warrior moved again, lashing out in a deadly arc. Vieira met him head-on. Darren didn't wait. He lunged forward, bringing the metal shard down toward the warrior's exposed side. It wasn't a clean hit, but it was enough. The warrior staggered, giving Vieira an opening. She didn't hesitate, one fluid motion, and her blade found its mark. The warrior let out a final, choked breath before collapsing. Silence fell over the jungle once more. Darren exhaled shakily. That was too close. Vieira wiped her blade clean. They will not stop. Darren knew she was right. One down didn't mean much. The rest of the hunting party was still out there. They had to move. Without another word, they pushed forward, their steps quickened by urgency. Minutes stretched into an eternity, but finally, the sound of rushing water reached them. The river. Darren nearly collapsed with relief as they reached the edge of the bank. The water was fast-moving, dark, and deep. It wasn't an ideal escape, but it was their best shot. Vieiris turned to him. "We cross here." Darren eyed the current warily. "You sure we won't just get swept away?" Vieiris stepped into the water without hesitation. Better that than being caught. He couldn't argue with that. Taking a deep breath, Darren followed. The icy water swallowed him instantly, dragging at his limbs. He fought against the pull, keeping his head above the surface as he let the current carry him downstream. Vieiris swam ahead, cutting through the water with practiced ease. Darren struggled to keep up, but he forced himself forward. Behind them, the jungle remained eerily silent. No shouts. No pursuit. For the first time that night, Darren dared to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. But then, just as they neared the opposite bank, Vieiris suddenly tensed. Darren saw it a second later. A shadow looming above them. Waiting. The shadow above them moved. Darren barely had time to register the massive figure standing at the riverbank before something pierced the water with terrifying force. A spear, long, jagged, and aimed directly at him. Vieiris reacted instantly, slamming into Darren and knocking them both beneath the surface. The icy grip of the river swallowed him whole, cutting off his breath as they tumbled through the current. Darren fought against the rushing water, struggling to get his bearings. Through the murky depths, he could make out Vieiris's form moving with practiced ease, her golden eyes catching what little light penetrated the river. Then, another disturbance. Something heavy plunged into the water beside them. Darren didn't need to guess. The Zalari warriors weren't just waiting on the shore, they were coming in after them. Vieiris grabbed his arm, her grip firm, and yanked him forward. No time for hesitation. No time for doubt. They kicked with all their strength, letting the river carry them away from their pursuers. The current pulled them faster, deeper. Darren's lungs burned, screaming for air. He could feel his vision tunneling, his body slowing. Then, Vieiris dragged them both up. They broke the surface with a gasp. Darren sucked in precious air, his limbs shaking as they drifted toward the far bank. Behind them, the glow of Zalari eyes cut through the dark. The warriors were still following, but the river had carried them farther than expected. They had seconds. "Move!" Vieiris commanded, hauling herself onto the shore. Darren scrambled up after her, his soaked clothes weighing him down. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he forced himself forward. The jungle beyond the river was different, denser, wilder. The trees here twisted unnaturally, their bark glowing faintly in eerie bioluminescence. Darren didn't have time to take in the alien beauty of it all. A guttural snarl behind them reminded him that their hunters were still on their heels. They ran. Darren's legs burned with every step, his breath ragged, but he didn't dare slow down. Vieiris led the way, her movements sharp and precise. She knew this terrain, she knew where to step, where to avoid. Then she stopped. Darren nearly crashed into her. "Why?" She raised a hand. "Listen." He did. Silence. No more shouts. No footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. The hunting party had stopped. Vieiris's expression darkened. "They will not follow." Darren wiped sweat from his brow, still catching his breath. "That's good, right?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked ahead, into the dark expanse of the jungle. Darren followed her gaze, and felt a chill crawl up his spine. The trees ahead twisted unnaturally, their glowing bark pulsing faintly, as if breathing. Strange vines hung low, dripping with a thick, viscous fluid. The air itself felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Something was wrong. Vieiris exhaled sharply. They have driven us into cursed ground. Darren blinked. Cursed. Vieiris's claws flexed. A dead zone. Few who enter return. Darren ran a hand through his wet hair, glancing behind them. The Zalari warriors remained at the river's edge, watching but making no move to cross. They weren't willing to step into this place. Darren turned back to Vieiris. And yet we're going in. She met his gaze, unyielding. We have no choice. Something about the way she said it made his stomach twist. Still, she was right. If they turned back, they were dead. With a slow breath, Darren nodded. Lead the way. Vieiris hesitated for only a second before pressing forward. Darren followed. The deeper they went, the stranger the jungle became. The air carried a low hum, vibrating just beneath the surface of sound. The trees swayed despite the lack of wind. And then, a whisper. It was faint, almost indistinct, but it brushed against Darren's mind like a feather. A voice, just beyond understanding. He stopped. Did you hear that? He murmured. Vieiris turned to him sharply. Do not listen. Darren frowned. But. She stepped closer, gripping his arm. Do not listen, she repeated, her voice low and firm. Her expression sent a shiver down his spine. She wasn't just being cautious. She was afraid. That scared him more than anything. Before he could question her further, the jungle shifted. A presence loomed. The whispers grew louder. And something in the darkness watched them. The whispers slithered through the air, curling around Darren's mind like unseen tendrils. He gritted his teeth, trying to shake the strange pull of the voices. They weren't words exactly, more like fragmented thoughts, scattered impressions clawing at his subconscious. Vieiris moved quickly, her golden eyes darting through the shifting trees. Do not answer them, she said, her voice tense. Darren swallowed. Answer who? She didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed his wrist and pulled him forward. The jungle felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. The trees, once merely twisted, now pulsed faintly, their bark shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Shapes moved in the darkness, silent, waiting. Darren's pulse hammered in his ears. Then the ground beneath them trembled. A guttural snarl tore through the unnatural silence, and suddenly, the shadows weren't just watching anymore. They were moving. From the darkness, shapes emerged, tall, gaunt figures with elongated limbs and hollow, glimmering eyes. They were unlike any Zalari Darren had seen before. Their armor was ancient, their bodies scarred with patterns that glowed faintly in the dim light. And they were blocking the path. Vieiris tensed, her body coiling like a spring. She spoke in her native tongue, her voice careful, measured. One of the figures stepped forward. Its voice came as a rasping whisper, barely audible. Vieiris exhaled sharply. Then, to Darren's surprise, she knelt. What the hell are you doing? He hissed. She didn't look at him. These are the forgotten. Darren frowned. Forgotten. They were exiled to this place long ago. They should not be alive. Yet they were. And they were watching them with an intensity that made Darren's skin crawl. The lead figure tilted its head, whispering something in response. Vieiris stiffened. They know why we are here. Darren barely had time to process that before the creature pointed a clawed hand toward him. Then it spoke again, this time in a voice he could understand. You are claimed. Darren blinked. What? The creature's hollow gaze shifted to Vieiris. You defied the right. You chose him. A tense silence followed. Vieiris's shoulders squared. Yes. The figures exchanged glances, their whispers swirling like wind through dead leaves. Then the leader spoke again. Then the choice is sealed. Before Darren could ask what that meant, the air around them shifted. The jungle, which had felt suffocating moments ago, seemed to pull back, the shadows retreating. The figures stepped aside, clearing a path. Viaris rose. Darren hesitated, but she motioned for him to follow. "We are free to leave." Darren narrowed his eyes. "Just like that?" She met his gaze. "It seems the Forgotten respect those who break chains." There was something in her voice, something resolute. Darren didn't press further. They walked past the silent figures, stepping out of the cursed jungle. The whispers faded. The air lightened. And then, finally, they saw the first light of dawn cresting the horizon. The hunting party was gone. The Zalari warriors had not followed. They were free. Darren turned to Vieiris. "So, what now?" She regarded him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "We survive." Darren exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Could be worse." She actually huffed a small, amused breath. For the first time since the nightmare began, something like peace settled between them. They were exiles now. But they were alive. And together, they would find a way forward.